I want you to picture this moment with me. In the early hours of January 3rd, 2026, explosions rang out over the Venezuelan capital of Caracas. Military installations were struck. The United States government launched a surprise offensive inside the sovereign territory of another country. And by dawn, President Donald Trump announced that Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, along with his wife, had been captured and flown out of Venezuela by U.S. forces. Reuters +1. Yes, you heard that right. The sitting president of a foreign nation was seized in a military operation ordered by the White House and transported under U.S. control. That alone is historical. But here is the thing. Congress never authorized this use of force. The Constitution says that only Congress can declare war, and the legal basis for this strike is not only murky, it's practically non-existent by any democratic or international law standard. AP News. What makes this worse is this. Even as the world teeters on the edge of geopolitical chaos, President Trump celebrated the operation on social media and promised more details at a press conference from his Mar-a-Lago residence. He compared this to past U.S. interventions, like the 1989 capture of Panama's Noriega, but many world leaders are calling the attack a blatant violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. AP News. Today, I want to break down exactly what happened, why it matters, what it means for America's democracy, how it could reshape the 2026 elections, and why this reckless exercise of power is far more than just a foreign policy spectacle. Stay with me. Let's start with the basics. At around 2 a.m. Venezuela time on January 3rd, the United States launched a series of strikes on Venezuelan military facilities, including air bases and installations in and around Caracas. Explosions were reported as smoke rose from strategic areas in the capital. Within hours, President Trump issued a statement saying that Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife had been captured and were being transported to the United States to face criminal charges, including narcotics offenses. Reuters +1. This operation was described as large-scale and involved U.S. Special Operations Forces, reportedly Delta Force, acting in coordination with unidentified law enforcement agencies. Within hours of the announcement, the Venezuelan government declared a state of emergency and called citizens to protest what it called an imperialist attack. Reuters. International reaction was immediate and divided. Countries like Russia and Iran condemned the U.S. action as a breach of international law. Others expressed cautious support for removing Maduro, but criticized the lack of legal justification for the assault. Inside Venezuela, the situation on the ground was chaotic. Protests both for and against Maduro erupted, and confusion spread about who was actually in charge. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez demanded public proof of Maduro's location and condition. Reuters +1. Let's be clear about what this means. Under the U.S. Constitution, the power to declare war lies with Congress. That is a fundamental check on presidential power. Yet there is no evidence that Congress was consulted or authorized this strike. That alone should alarm every American, regardless of political affiliation. What we are looking at here is the unilateral use of military force by the executive branch with no clear constitutional authority. AP News. That should terrify you. The White House claims Maduro is a drug trafficker and a dictator whose regime has contributed to regional instability. That narrative is long-standing. But the rules of law, both domestic and international, exist precisely to constrain unchecked power. The fact that we are even debating whether the president can order a military assault and kidnap a foreign head of state without congressional sanction tells you something deep and disturbing about where power resides in Washington today. Here's the thing. This is not some minor skirmish or diplomatic dispute. We need to understand the gravity of what has happened. We are now witnessing the first significant U.S. military intervention in Latin America in decades, and it was ordered by the president with no authorized declaration of war. The U.S. is transporting a foreign head of state into its custody to face charges. The U.S. is engaged in direct conflict in another sovereign nation, and the legal basis for this action is opaque at best. Wikipedia. The implications of this are massive. First, at home, this surrender of congressional war powers to the president sets an alarming precedent. If presidents can unilaterally decide to invade another country or detain its leaders, then what stops the next president from doing the same? Do we now live in a reality where the Constitution's separation of powers means nothing on foreign policy? Is Congress merely ceremonial, a rubber stamp powerless to stop an imperial presidency? That is the question this episode raises. Second, for U.S. democracy. When a president uses military force without clear legal authority, it weakens public trust in constitutional governance. Citizens begin to believe that checks and balances are irrelevant, that the letter of the law is optional, and that powerful leaders can do whatever they want if they have enough loyalists. That is how democracies decay. This is not hyperbole. There is a reason the founding generation gave Congress the war power, to prevent the very concentration of power we are seeing now. Third, on the world stage, U.S. credibility has already been fractured by years of chaotic foreign policy decisions. By acting unilaterally in Venezuela, the U.S. risks alienating long-standing allies, undermining international norms, and setting off a new cycle of instability in the Western Hemisphere. Many nations are already condemning the action as illegal and imperialistic. This does not make America safer. It makes it more unpredictable. Now, I want to talk about the political fallout inside the United States. This isn't happening in a vacuum. The U.S. is heading into the 2026 midterm elections, a high-stakes political battleground. Republicans currently hold narrow majorities in both the House and Senate, and the party is trying to fend off Democratic hopes of regaining control. Democrats are targeting key battleground races nationwide. New York Post. This Venezuelan intervention, ordered by President Trump, now becomes entangled with those electoral dynamics. Here is the core question. Is this an attempt to create a distraction? To rally nationalist sentiment? To shift media coverage away from domestic issues, like the economy, inflation, and Republican electoral vulnerability? That is exactly what many analysts are asking right now. This decision comes at a moment when President Trump's approval ratings are weak and Republicans are deeply uncertain about their prospects. Some Republicans in Congress are openly worried that they could be swept out of office in the fall. KansasReflector.com. So ask yourself this: would a president with nothing to gain politically launch a risky military operation that could lead to U.S. casualties, international criticism, and possible long-term entanglement? Or is this exactly the kind of spectacle authoritarian-leaning leaders resort to when they need to change the news cycle and rally the base? Keep this in mind. The White House insists it will offer more details, but so far, the legal justification, the strategic endgame, and the exit plan are all unclear. Not one congressional leader from either party has said they were consulted. That should alarm you. Here is why this is more serious than it appears. This reflects a broader pattern in American governance. It is the culmination of years of executive overreach. We have seen presidents use military force without explicit congressional authorization. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria. And Congress has done little more than issue empty resolutions. Now we have a president bypassing Congress altogether in a direct intervention that involves regime change. That is the very definition of power without restraint. And the consequences extend beyond one operation. This intervention sends a clear signal to the world. The United States will no longer be bound by its own constitutional norms when it comes to war and peace. That invites instability, emboldens rivals, and undermines alliances. It also puts everyday Americans at risk. Once presidents start using unilateral military force as a political tool, the threshold for conflict lowers. That means more military engagements abroad, more danger for U.S. service members, and more chances of a small strike escalating into something much larger. Look at how other countries are reacting. Nations like Russia and Iran have condemned the U.S. action. International organizations are questioning its legality. This is not just a regional spat. It is becoming a flashpoint in broader geopolitical rivalries. And here is the other truth. The legal footing for this intervention is weak. There was no declaration of war. Congress never passed an authorization, and international law requires either a Security Council mandate or a clear case of self-defense, neither of which exists here. Wikipedia. We are in uncharted waters. So where do we go from here? First, Americans need to understand the stakes. This is not just foreign policy news. This is constitutional news. This is about whether the framework that has kept America a republic for over 2 centuries still means anything. Second, Congress must act, not rhetorically, but with actual legal authority. It must reassert its war powers. It must hold hearings. It must demand accountability for the use of force. Failing to do so will only invite more abuses. Third, voters need to demand that their elected officials respect the rule of law, not just when it is convenient, but as a matter of principle. And finally, we must not be distracted by spectacle. Elective warfare, unilateral executive action, and political opportunism have no place in a constitutional republic. Here is the bottom line. America cannot remain great by ignoring its own laws and crushing other nations by force. That is not leadership. That is tyranny in disguise. That is the core takeaway from what happened in Venezuela and why it matters to every single American. If you found this analysis meaningful, share it widely. Subscribe, stay informed, and do not let anyone tell you that constitutional limits are optional. Because if we lose that, we lose everything. Thank you for listening.